coming along again, thank you, to Eco Views and News. This week we want to look particularly at what's called the China factor. And I'm going to focus actually on a title that was printed by the BBC in a commentary by Richard Black called Who's Talking and Who's Listening? Who's talking, of course, is President Hu of the People's Republic of China. And he was talking very specifically at the UN, a very important meeting at the UN which took place since we last met. And you probably saw some of the information about it on the airways. If you didn't, you should listen to what Ban Ki-moon himself introduced all the panelists with and the successive speakers. Very important and urgent message on his part. It's worth listening to in detail. He was among the first speakers, but certainly not the last. Indeed, the heads of state from a lot of different parts of the world came together in New York for this conference and had a great deal to share in New York. It was called for some the New York Climate Week for this reason, but it was really kind of an international week.
Cargill is helping new ideas.
Carries these things with ads these days, and you're lucky to get through to the news at any point. They sometimes forget to go beyond the ad and just have the ad sort of sit there for a while. But we'll try to reload it again here and see if the BBC can remember that this was a news story. Since they've gone commercial, they seem to have lapsed into this kind of posing the ads, sometimes very inappropriately. I mean, they'll have an ad for vacations just before a report on flood damage in a typhoon or something. It's really rather sad, but they have to pay for it somehow, and this is the way they've obviously chosen. So we'll try it again here to see if we can get access to it from the BBC pages. Once again, they're running an ad before the news, and we'll see if they ever get to the news itself. It seems that they're kind of stuck on their own ads here. It's really quite discouraging if you're trying to get in touch with the news. It used to be the world's premier news agency, and it seems now to have been given over to a series of promotionals. Well, we may not be able to use it if it's just not going to cooperate. But the BBC commentary was by Richard Black, entitled Who's Talking and Who's Listening? Now, the Who's Talking, obviously, was an allusion to President Hu, Hu Jintao, who made a major speech at the UN this past end of the week of September. And it's a good question as to who's listening. Is anyone in the Western world listening is a real big question. There is some very important information being conveyed, but it's hard to listen when you're talking a lot yourself. And this was also a week during which a great deal of talking was done in the Western world about itself. and in reference to itself. And so a lot of the, in a sense, the news was crowded out by our own personalities, as it were. That is, news being, in a sense, like politics, most relevant to what goes on most closely to home. It's often the case that we'll report on what's nearby before we'll report on what's important. In any case, John Kerry, along with Barbara Boxer, introduced this last week, a very important piece of legislation that you may have heard about as well. But it too seems to be hung up here on a connection that we're not getting any response to. So we'll quickly try to quit all of these things and see if we can reinitiate them in another browser. Sometimes the Internet Explorer browser just doesn't cooperate and doesn't pull any of these things in. So we'll try it in a different browser at the time. We can get it connected, and in particular we'll try it in the Firefox browser if we can get this to release the audio card. Okay. Now, in this particular case, we were looking for John Kerry's statement, but we'll see if we can pull it up here.
The proposal comes as Senate Democrats introduce their version of a climate bill imposing federal limits on greenhouse gases. The measure would cut emissions 20% from 2005 levels over the next decade. It would also allow polluters to swap emissions credits under a program identical to cap and trade. Appearing with co-sponsor Senator Barbara Boxer, Senate Foreign Relations Chair John Kerry said addressing global warming is essential to U.S. security.
Washington is used to letting big oil and special interests stand between us and the goals of everyday citizens. And after the last few months, we know what's coming. People will say we can't afford to act. But you know the truth. You know it, all of you. And we know the truth, those of us standing here, and those who serve in the military know the truth, which is why they're here today. The truth is our security and our economy will both be strengthened, and we can't afford not to act.
So, Senator Kerry and Senator Boxer introduced this bill this last week, and in fact, they're arguing that it's a security issue, and we can't afford not to act. In fact, both of their websites and other shows like the Tavis Smiley Show and the Living on Earth Show have extended interviews with these individuals, and you probably picked it up during the week. And it's for that reason that we may not have listened to, especially if we listened to the opposition, we may not have listened to anything beyond our own borders, in a sense. We had both Democrats and Republicans vying for time on the cameras, and ultimately they've decided, in effect, that they're not going to be able to pass anything this month before the meetings in Copenhagen. And so our leaders are debating back and forth without a whole lot of leadership coming forth. And it's clear that if nothing is passed in the Senate, if it's not even approved in committee, it's not a strong position to go into the international talks in Copenhagen in December. So Carol Browner apparently admitted the other day, and it was reported in this morning's paper, that in effect there'll be no agreement by the end of this year. Well, that's a pretty discouraging position to take. For that reason, it's probably pretty important to listen to, in fact, what the Chinese have said, in part because they are taking the initiative and they are saying things that are really quite new in this respect. If we can call them up again, we'll give another try to the internet connections here. But basically, the BBC carried the speech, or at least major portions of it, of the Chinese leader when he was in New York on the 22nd of September. And we'll see if we can catch it, because it's an important speech when our own senators are talking to each other and basically arguing as to whether they can get anything through the Congress. It's other leaders who've taken over the initiative. Once again, let's try to call it up with a different browser. If this one isn't going to work, we'll disable it. See if it comes up in the Firefox browser. Doesn't seem to come up there either. It doesn't like the flash video sequence at all. So we'll try it on a separate page here. Once again, the BBC seems to be able to carry its ads, but not its news stories. And it's very disappointing. But let's see if they, after they congratulate themselves on Cargill for delivering things to France, let's see if they can get on to global issues. Well, it's the first time we've got the BBC News logo page, and perhaps here we go.
China will further integrate our actions on climate change into our economic and social development plans and take the following forceful measures. First, we will intensify our effort to conserve energy and improve energy efficiency. We will endeavor to cut carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP by a notable margin by 2020 from the 2005 level. Second, we will vigorously develop renewable energy and nuclear energy. We will endeavor to increase the share of non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption to around 15% by 2020. Third, we will energetically increase forest carbon sink. We will endeavor to increase forest coverage by 40 million hectares and forest stock volume by 1.3 billion cubic meters by 2020 from the 2005 levels. Fourth, we will step up our efforts to develop green economy, low-carbon economy, and circular economy. and enhance research, development and dissemination of climate-friendly technologies. Dear colleagues, China stands ready to work with all countries to build an even better future for the generations to come. Thank you all.
Okay, there was the full statement, and he left the podium then to much applause. But basically, so much applause because, in effect, the others, while saying that they should do something, didn't indicate 4 targets, as the Chinese delegation did. And in doing so, they took the challenge, in a sense. The Western leaders still sort of sat around and said they should do things, and they even made pronouncements about what China should do and how we need to get China on board, as it were. Well, they didn't bother to look at the fact that China is not only a question of getting on board, they're actually out in front at this point in a lot of respects. Now, this was the Minister for the Environment in Britain, a fellow named Ed Miliband, who was carried on their own Guardian newspaper in an interview where he's basically saying, well, we've got to get China on board.
The UK Climate Change Secretary Ed Miliband was recently in China to see the impact of global warming on the far western deserts of Gansu province. He also looked at countermeasures in agriculture, industry and politics. In an interview with The Guardian in Beijing, he explains why he's optimistic that the world's biggest carbon emitter could be ready to strike a deal at climate talks in Copenhagen later this year.
Thanks very much for joining us for the Guardian's China Week. I'd like to talk to you about climate change in particular. How do you convince China to go far enough to persuade other countries that everyone is taking their fair share of the responsibility?
How do you convince China to go far enough? A very interesting formulation on the part of the journalist. Chinese are already ahead in many respects in terms of state initiatives than the Western world, and how do you convince them to do more? Very interesting.
China is central to any global agreement because of the scale of its emissions, the scale of its population, the importance of its emissions to future prospects, and also because China is an important global power and people will take notice in the developing and developed world of what China does. So it's central to any agreement. I have to say, from the talks that I have had with Chinese ministers, I'm incredibly encouraged by China's approach to these issues. They can see climate change happening in this country. They know that actually if climate change continues, it will affect them probably worse than others. Some people say up to 10% of their rice crop could go. Certain rivers could see up to 25% of their water taken away, up to 7 million people being flooded. All those are very pressing, urgent dangers for China. And
well, that's just it. I mean, China sees the crises a lot more quickly than those in the West, and they've been prepared to act now rather much more courageously, and it's a good thing, too. Tony Blair, a while back, pointed out what's at stake. He talked to the graduating class of 2008 at Yale at the time and gave an overview of what he thought was coming down the pike in China and why it was very important for us in the Western world to catch up, in a sense, with them, because there's a huge momentum, as he says, in the whole of the East. But he was focusing particularly on China and somewhat on India. Once again, we'll see if we can get the connection here to establish itself. But the speech is worth listening to in detail, in part because by articulating it, Tony Blair himself almost surprises himself with his own information. That is, he knows it's true on paper, but in saying it, it becomes even more real and more dramatic. Well, it seems like the pickup here from the station is just too slow for words. So we're not going to get Tony Blair speaking about it, I'm afraid. In any case, there was a lot of commentary, at least in the British press, not the American press, about what this really meant. That is, there was both what President Hu said and what it actually is going to mean in the long run for the development of new kinds of policies on the ground.
Climate change and China. Promises and politics. It's been a very busy week at the United Nations. The Chinese President Hu Jintao has said that his country will set mandatory targets to control the rise of greenhouse gas emissions, not to cut them, but to make them grow at a slower rate by using energy more efficiently, he said. One little bit was missing, though. He didn't say what the target would be. So I spoke to Richard Gledhill. He's a partner at the global consultants PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he's a specialist in green industries. I asked him what President Hu had said and what it means.
Well, what we've had from China, I think, is a declaration of intent, which is a real step forward. But as you say, the size of the commitment and the time frame over which it will be achieved is yet to be announced. But I think it's seen as quite a significant movement from the Chinese. If you look at the history of emissions growth in China over the last 15 years, we're already seeing emissions growing less rapidly than GDP. What we're expecting now on the back of the commitment from the President is to further reduce the growth in emissions. I think there's a real recognition of the importance of environmental issues in China. They're facing some real challenges in relation to air quality, water scarcity, land degradation, and there's a real commitment now to address these issues.
Okay, well, this seems to be the assessment of the British commentators on it, and I think you'll see that they in fact took this a little bit further than the Western observers did. At the same time, they're celebrating their 60th anniversary. You may have seen the big parades that took place at the time in Beijing. They're reminiscent of an older period in China where big parades took place in Tiananmen Square with kind of the great state panoply of power. And to much of the observing group that saw them, it looked pretty much like a kind of new industrialism aimed out of an old mold in some sense. But in any case, it was worth taking into account because a lot of that is aimed at Western imports. It's made in China, but it's an industry that's aimed at an export market. And the President can applaud it, but at the same time, it's happening with an extraordinary cost in the Chinese countryside and in the cities. The air is unbreathable in some of the cities. And for this reason, the commitment by China at the UN is seen to be an amazing breakthrough in this respect and a new challenge to the Western world. Friedman called it a new Sputnik and asserted that future historians may well conclude that the most important thing to happen in the last 18 months was that Red China decided to become green. There have been various discussions of that locally here, and you can pick it up on the news networks from the Boston area. And On Point, in particular, they do some coverage of this in a program recently. But in addition to this, there have been efforts to create wind farms in China. It's kind of funny to see the Chinese wall and big windmills in the background, but it's starting to happen at an amazing pace. The 11th of September issue of Science carried this, an article by Mike McElroy and Chris Nielsen, among others, two other graduate students at the Harvard Center here, have argued that basically the world is struggling with the question of how to move beyond carbon-rich fuels to something that's carbon-free, and he argues that China is basically going to take the initiative here. They have taken the initiative in a big way. So who's listening? Well, to some extent the scientists are listening because they realize that China has put their money where their mouth is in terms of directing their industries. Who else is listening? Well, the pundits are clearly not listening. In fact, if you look at it, people like Senator Inhofe seem to think that their perspective is the only one worth hearing, and they don't pay much attention to China. They have no interest and not much knowledge, and neither do the usual commentators like Beck or people like O'Reilly, who actually think the globe is cooling at this point. These people are not listening to what's being said, but we all ought to start listening for this simple reason. We're, in effect, a footnote on Chinese history at this point. What it does or does not do will determine the fate of our planet. We don't have much choice.